Before we dive in, tell me where you're listening from and what pulled you into this story. If it spoke to you, drop a comment. Your words help keep history's forgotten voices alive. Paris whispers her name like a curse. Catherine de Medici, the Serpent Queen, the woman with poison rings and black gowns, the foreign witch who ruined France. Paintings show her stiff and cold, eyes hooded, dressed in mourning as if she fed on death itself. Pamphlets from her enemies gave her fangs. Later, historians sharpened them. But here's the thing history rarely admits. France was already bleeding when Catherine stepped into power, already fractured, already violent, already desperate. And when a kingdom collapses, people don't want explanations, they want a villain. So they chose the woman who refused to disappear, because Catherine de Medici didn't rule with swords, she ruled with survival, and that made her dangerous. Catherine de Medici, the Serpent Queen, poison, power, and the woman. History needed to hate the queen. History turned into a monster. Catherine was born in Florence in 1519 into one of the most powerful families in Europe, and into immediate loss. Her parents died when she was still an infant. No lullabies, no protection, no illusions. She belonged to the Medici, a family rich in money, enemies, and ambition. In Renaissance Italy, that meant one thing very clearly. Catherine was not a child to be loved. She was an asset to be guarded, traded, and deployed. As Florence erupted in rebellion against Medici rule, Catherine, still a girl, was taken hostage by political enemies. She grew up surrounded by threats, bargaining chips, and the quiet understanding that her life depended on other people's calculations. This is where Catherine learned her first rule of power. Emotion gets you killed. Observation keeps you alive. At 14, she was shipped off to France like fine merchandise, married to Prince Henry, the second son of King Francis I. It sounded glamorous. It wasn't. The French court looked at her and saw everything they despised. She was Italian. She was from a banking family, not ancient nobility. She brought no great dowry by royal standards. They mocked her accent, her clothes, her manners. They called her the merchant's daughter behind silk sleeves. And her husband? Henry barely noticed her. He loved another woman, Diane de Poitiers, older, powerful, radiant, and very much alive in a court that treated Catherine like furniture. For years, Catherine existed in the background, smiling politely, listening carefully, saying very little. No children, no influence, no protection. At court, a queen who could not produce heirs was not a person. She was a problem waiting to be removed, and Catherine knew it. So she did what she would do her entire life. She waited. She watched how power actually moved, who whispered to whom, who mattered, who merely performed importance. She learned that France did not reward goodness, it rewarded usefulness, and Catherine de Medici intended to survive long enough to become necessary, not loved, not admired, necessary. That's where her story truly begins, because the moment Catherine stopped being invisible, France would never forgive her for it. Becoming necessary. For 10 years, Catherine de Medici lived in a kind of royal purgatory. She was queen in name, not in power. Wife in title, not in affection. Watched constantly, valued barely at all. And in Renaissance France, that was dangerous. Because queens who failed were not divorced politely, they were set aside, forgotten, sometimes eliminated. Catherine knew the clock was ticking, so she did the only thing that could save her. She produced heirs, not 1, not 2, but 10 children. Suddenly Catherine wasn't expendable anymore. She was the future of the Valois dynasty. The court's tone shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but enough for Catherine to notice. Smiles lasted longer, bowing went a fraction deeper. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms where she had once been ignored. Still, she was not in control, because Diane de Poitiers was. Diane held Henry's heart, his attention, his patronage. She signed letters, she influenced policy, she sat where Catherine should have sat. And here is where history gets lazy. They want Catherine to be jealous, bitter, scheming with poison in her sleeve. The truth is colder. Catherine endured. She did not challenge Diane openly, that would have been suicide. Instead, she learned from her, watched how a woman wielded power without a crown, how access mattered more than authority, how intimacy could bend policy. Catherine did not fight the system, she studied it. Then in 1559 everything cracked. King Henry II died suddenly after a jousting accident, his eye pierced by a splintered lance. The strongest man in France bled out slowly, painfully, publicly. And in that moment, Catherine did not cry in corners, she stepped into the void. Diane was removed from court almost immediately, exiled with shocking speed. The woman who had ruled France from the shadows was gone. And Catherine? She put on black. Not mourning black, power black. Her eldest son, Francis II, was crowned king. He was 15, sickly, weak, easily controlled, which meant something France had never fully prepared for had arrived, a mother with authority. Catherine de' Medici became Queen Mother, and with it, the most stable force in a collapsing court. Noble factions tore at each other. Religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants simmered toward violence. Foreign powers circled like vultures. And Catherine stood in the middle of it all. She was not idealistic. She was not sentimental. She was practical. She brokered marriages. She balanced factions. She listened more than she spoke. She played families against each other, not for amusement, but for containment. Because Catherine had learned something brutal early. France did not need a saint. It needed someone who could hold it together. And if that someone had to be feared, so be it. This is the moment the myth begins to form, because once Catherine held real power, the stories change. She was no longer the overlooked Italian wife. She became the woman blamed for everything that went wrong. And France was about to tear itself apart in ways that would make Catherine's reputation convenient. Next comes blood, religion, and a massacre history would never stop arguing about. The Queen, everyone needed to blame France, did not drift into chaos, it lunged. By the 1560s, the country was split down a fault line that ran through every family, every city, every marriage, Catholic versus Protestant. The French wars of religion weren't ideological debates. They were street fights, assassinations, riots disguised as sermons. And Catherine de' Medici was standing in the middle of a powder keg with children for kings, 3 of them in fact. After Francis II died young, then Charles IX took the throne. A boy again. Another fragile crown. Another reign that required a regent in all but name. Catherine became the constant. She was not ruling instead of her sons, she was ruling for them, guiding, restraining, negotiating, trying desperately to keep France from bleeding out while grown men wrapped violence in theology and called it righteousness. Here's the part that never fits cleanly into a villain narrative. Catherine tried compromise. She hosted religious colloquies, issued edicts of tolerance, married her children across factional lines. She listened to Protestants when Catholic nobles wanted them crushed, and listened to Catholics when Protestants demanded equality overnight. To extremists on both sides, this made her dangerous because moderation threatens people who profit from chaos. And then came the wedding. August 1572, Paris. Catherine arranged the marriage of her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, to Henry of Navarre, a prominent Protestant. The goal was clear: unity, a symbolic ceasefire, a moment where France might breathe again. Thousands of Protestant nobles flooded into Paris for the celebrations, and someone tried to assassinate their leader, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. The shot missed, killing him, but not the consequences. Panic spread, rumors ignited, Catholic factions feared retaliation, Protestant leaders demanded justice. The court was suddenly surrounded by armed men who trusted no one. This is where the story fractures. Did Catherine order what came next? Did she panic? Did she calculate? Did she lose control or attempt to seize it? Historians still argue because the truth is uncomfortable. What happened was not the action of a single woman. It was the collapse of restraint. On the night of August 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day, the violence exploded. Bells rang, doors were kicked in, men were dragged into streets and murdered, bodies filled the Seine. The massacre spread from Paris into the provinces, fed by fear, opportunism, and long-simmering hatred. Thousands died. And when the smoke cleared, France looked for a face to pin it to. They chose Catherine because she was foreign, because she was a woman, because she had power without a sword in her hand. They painted her as a spider in black, pulling strings, dripping poison from her rings. They erased the mobs, the generals, the priests who incited violence. They simplified catastrophe into a single villain. It was easier that way. But here is the truth history resists. If Catherine was ruthless, she was ruthless in a system that rewarded bloodshed. If she was calculating, she calculated in a country tearing itself apart. If she made terrible choices, she did so while trying to prevent something worse. France survived, barely, and Catherine remained, still mother, still mediator, still blamed. But after St. Bartholomew's Day, something shifted. Catherine stopped believing France wanted peace and began preparing for survival, the woman who learned how to outlive chaos. After St. Bartholomew's Day, Catherine de' Medici stopped being surprised by violence. She didn't recoil from it. She didn't romanticize it. She planned around it. France had shown her something brutal and clarifying. There would be no clean victory, no moral resolution, no side that would simply lay down its weapons because reason asked nicely. The country would not be saved by ideals. It would be held together, if at all, by endurance. And Catherine was very good at endurance. Her son, Charles IX, never recovered from the massacre. He grew sickly, paranoid, haunted by what had happened under his reign. He died young, leaving the throne to another boy shaped by grief and suspicion. Henry III, another crown, another fragile king, another moment where Catherine became the axis around which France turned. But something had changed in her. She no longer tried to be loved. She tried to be unavoidable. Catherine built power the way architects build cathedrals, quietly, methodically, with an eye toward centuries rather than seasons. She cultivated networks instead of armies, information instead of force, loyalty not through affection, but through dependency. She knew who needed money, who needed silence, who needed protection, who needed a marriage arranged before scandal ruined them, and she remembered everything. This is where the poison ring myth flourished, not because it was true, but because it felt true to people watching a woman move pieces without ever raising her voice. When men ordered executions, it was called authority. When Catherine maneuvered alliances, it was called sorcery. Because the truth was harder to accept, she was better at the game. Catherine used spectacle the way others used swords, court festivals, pageantry, art, architecture. She turned the French court into a stage where power was performed so elaborately that rivals lost sight of the machinery underneath. While they argued doctrine, she managed logistics. While they fought duels, she controlled succession. While they screamed about faith, she balanced budgets and bloodlines. And all the while, pamphlets multiplied. She was accused of black magic, of consulting astrologers, of summoning demons, of whispering death into her son's ears. But here's the thing Catherine understood better than anyone. Rumors are useful. They distract from reality. They inflate fear. They keep enemies guessing. Let them believe she was supernatural. It made her harder to predict and therefore harder to challenge. Yet power extracted its cost. By the late years of her life, Catherine had outlived nearly everyone she loved. Her children ruled briefly, disastrously, or both. Her efforts kept France intact but scarred. The Valois line weakened. The throne trembled. She had held the country together with thread and will, and the thread was fraying. Still, Catherine refused to vanish quietly. She remained at court, advising, warning, maneuvering, an older woman now, dressed in black, not as mourning, but as armor. Watching the next generation repeat the same mistakes with louder voices and shorter memories, they called her manipulative, they called her cruel, they called her the Serpent Queen. But snakes don't strike randomly, they strike to survive, and Catherine de' Medici survived longer than anyone expected. History needed a villain. France needed a survivor. Catherine de' Medici died in 1589. France did not exhale. There was no moment of relief, no sudden moral clarity, no sense that the darkness had lifted with her passing. The wars continued, the blood continued, the throne continued to wobble beneath men who had inherited a country held together by compromise and exhaustion, and that, more than any poison ring or whispered spell, is Catherine's real legacy. She did not create France's violence. She inherited it. She did not ignite religious hatred. She navigated it. She did not rule because she wanted power for its own sake. She ruled because every alternative ended in collapse. History prefers clean stories, heroes and villains, saints and monsters. Catherine fit neither, so she was flattened into something easier to hate. A foreigner, a woman, a mother whose sons failed loudly, a ruler who did not apologize for survival. Men butchered cities and were remembered as kings. Catherine balanced factions and was remembered as a serpent. Because power in a woman unsettles the story people want to tell about order. She was blamed for the sins of an entire era, because blaming her meant absolving everyone else. The nobility, the generals, the preachers who turned pulpits into weapons, the men who signed death warrants and slept soundly afterward. Catherine became the vessel for France's guilt, and that is the oldest trick in history. When chaos cannot be undone, it must be personified. When violence cannot be justified, it must be feminized. When power refuses to behave politely, it must be labeled unnatural. So Catherine became poison, magic, manipulation, the Serpent Queen. But look closer. She governed in a world that did not forgive hesitation. She ruled through sons who were too young, too fragile, too hunted. She faced factions that would gladly burn France to ash rather than compromise. And she held, not cleanly, not gently, but effectively. She understood something most moralizers never do. Leadership in catastrophe is not about purity, it's about endurance. Catherine de' Medici did not save France, but she prevented it from tearing itself apart long enough for something new to rise from the wreckage. That makes her dangerous to remember honestly, because if Catherine wasn't a monster, and if she was simply a woman who learned how power really works, then the story changes. Then the question becomes not what kind of woman was Catherine de' Medici, but why does history only trust women when they lose? And that question still hasn't stopped haunting us. The women history forgives only after they're gone. Catherine de' Medici has been dead for more than 4 centuries, and yet she is still on trial. Every generation reopens the case. Every era sharpens the same accusations. Poisoner, puppet master, witch, cold mother, monster behind the throne. The language changes, but the verdict rarely does, because Catherine represents a problem history never solved. She was a woman who ruled without asking to be liked. And that is the one thing power will never forgive in a woman. Men who ruled through fear were called decisive. Men who massacred cities were called necessary. Men who failed spectacularly were still granted complexity. Catherine was granted myth. Her intelligence became manipulation. Her caution became deceit. Her refusal to break became cruelty. And motherhood, her greatest political liability, became her final indictment. She did what kings had done for centuries. She protected her dynasty. She maneuvered marriages. She neutralized threats. She chose stability over sentiment. But when a woman does these things, the story curdles. A mother who governs is not seen as pragmatic. She is seen as unnatural. A woman who outlives her son's reigns is not resilient. She is blamed for their weakness. A queen who refuses to disappear into widowhood becomes suspect simply for remaining visible. Catherine outlasted too many men. And history does not like survivors, especially female ones. So the legend grew, poison rings glinting in candlelight, darkened corridors, foreign sorcery whispering through silk sleeves, because it is easier to believe a woman ruled through magic than to accept she ruled through competence. Monsters excuse failure, witches make convenient endings, But Catherine's true crime was simpler and far more threatening. She proved that power does not require permission. She governed through patience, calculation, and endurance in a world that expected her to be ornamental, silent, or dead. She did not seduce power. She did not steal it. She held it, longer than anyone expected, longer than anyone wanted. And that unsettled the story, because if Catherine de' Medici was not a serpent, if she was a strategist trapped in an impossible century, then history has to confront something uncomfortable, that women have always been capable of ruling well, that chaos is not created by female ambition, that sometimes the woman blamed for everything was the only one keeping it from getting worse. Catherine does not need redemption. She needs accuracy, and accuracy reveals something far more disturbing than any legend. France did not survive despite Catherine de' Medici. France survived because of her, and that truth is still dangerous enough to make people reach for poison instead. The serpent was never the monster. Catherine de' Medici did not die hated. She died exhausted. In January of 1589, after decades of civil war, betrayal, and ruling through the reigns of fragile sons and collapsing certainties, Catherine finally stepped away from the machinery she had kept running with her bare hands. Within months, her last surviving son, King Henry III, was assassinated. The Valois dynasty ended not with a roar, but with a quiet unraveling. And just like that, Catherine became convenient. Dead women cannot defend themselves. Dead women can be rewritten. So history did what it always does when faced with a woman whose power it cannot comfortably explain. It turned her into a symbol instead of a person. The Black Queen, the poisoner, the witch behind the throne. The story hardened into myth because myth is easier than nuance, easier than admitting that France's blood-soaked century did not erupt because of Catherine, but would likely have collapsed without her. She did not invent violence. She inherited it. She did not crave chaos. She managed it. Catherine ruled in an era where compromise was seen as weakness, mercy as failure, and women as liabilities. She was surrounded by men who mistook cruelty for strength and certainty for wisdom. When those men failed, she absorbed the blame. When they succeeded, she vanished from the credit, because history prefers women either powerless or pure. Catherine was neither. She was strategic, she was pragmatic, she was relentless in her refusal to let the crown fall into the hands of men who would burn France faster than she ever could, and that made her unforgivable. So the poison rings glittered brighter in the retelling. The shadows grew longer, the whispers louder. Every act of governance became a sin. Every attempt at stability became manipulation. Because if Catherine was simply competent, if she was simply doing what any ruler would do, then the entire myth collapses, and what's left is something far more unsettling. That one of the most influential rulers of Renaissance Europe was a woman, history trained us to fear instead of understand. Catherine de' Medici was not the serpent in the garden. She was the gardener, trying desperately to keep something alive in poisoned soil. And maybe that is why her story still unnerves us. Because it forces a final, uncomfortable question. How many women were called monsters simply because they survived long enough to be blamed? Catherine did not need magic to rule. She needed endurance. And that, more than poison or prophecy, is what history truly resents. Every era creates its villains, and every era decides which women are allowed to be remembered kindly. Catherine de' Medici reminds us that when a woman refuses to disappear, when she stays visible, capable, and unafraid to wield power, the story does not ask what she did. It asks how quickly we can make her dangerous. That is the real myth worth questioning, and the reason her story still matters.
And that's where we leave her, on the page, in the archive, in the rumor, in the shadow she carved into history. Maybe she was a villain. Maybe she was a victim. Maybe she was something far more dangerous, a woman who refused the role she was handed. But one thing is certain, the world wasn't ready for her then, and it still isn't now. If you enjoyed falling down this rabbit hole of power, defiance, and the women history tried to bury, make sure you're here for the next chapter, because there are more of them, more rebels, more survivors, more legends disguised as scandals. Until next time, keep questioning the stories you were told, and keep an eye on the women they warned you about.